Welcome to today's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP CEO Patrick Costello.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon from Washington and welcome to today's virtual meeting. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and allies have imposed sanctions and taken other actions affecting economic engagement, access to financial instruments and resources and trade against Russia that are unprecedented in terms of their comprehensiveness, coordination, and swiftness. Within the United States, new measures were primarily imposed by the executive branch, but Congress has sought to widen the range of economic targets and further curtail Russian government's access to financial and other resources. Beyond the size and scope of these economic measures, there's a new variable here: cryptocurrencies. European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde has said that there are signs that some Russians are attempting to bypass sanctions over the war in Ukraine by converting rubles into cryptocurrencies and stablecoins. And today, this is a particularly timely conversation given the additional sanctions that were announced just earlier this morning. Joining us this afternoon to discuss the sanctions imposed on Russia, how they might be tightened, and the crypto angle are three extremely qualified experts who have a wealth of experience looking at sanctions, Russia's oligarchy, financial crimes, and blockchain-based payment systems. We have Dr. Louise Shelley. She is the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the George Mason University. She's a leading expert on the relationship between terrorism, organized crime, and corruption, as well as human trafficking, transnational crime, and terrorism, with a particular focus on the former Soviet Union. She also specializes in illicit financial flows and money laundering. We also are joined by the Honorable Juan Zarate, who served as the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes during the George W. Bush administration. He also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism, where he was responsible for developing and implementing the U.S. counterterrorism strategy and policies related to transnational security threats, including anti-money laundering, kleptocracy, and transnational organized crime. And last but certainly not least, we have Mandeep Walia, who is the Chief Compliance and Risk Officer of Circle Internet Financial. He has had an extensive career in global financial compliance and risk management at leading organizations and is a leading expert in compliance and risk for blockchain-based payment systems. Thank you all for joining us. As we mentioned at the top, this meeting is on the record. We're going to post it on our website. I'm going to engage our panelists in conversation at the start of the program, but I encourage our audience to submit their questions via the Q&A function that you can find in the bottom of your Zoom window. Juan, let's start with you, and let's just discuss the scope of these sanctions, which are unprecedented. We have financial sanctions targeting the Russian central bank, Russian sovereign debt, Russian financial institutions. The list goes on and on. There's also trade sanctions. So if you can just give us your initial thoughts on the scope of these measures, and perhaps most importantly, the effectiveness, considering that we are using economic instruments to alter the political calculation of the intended target, President Putin.
Thank you, Patrick. It's an honor to be with you and Louise and Mandeep having this discussion at a critical time, obviously. You're right that the weight of the response to the war against Ukraine by Russia and the invasion by Russia, the weight has been put on sanctions and financial measures primarily, with the U.S. and NATO proclaiming that they will not get involved directly. Obviously, there are weapon supplies and humanitarian aid. But in terms of imposing a cost on Russia, and in the words of the Europeans, trying to cripple the Russian economy as a result of their actions, that has fallen on sanctions and the financial measures you described. And what's fascinating here is that just a few months ago, Patrick, you know this from your policy work, the discussion in Washington and elsewhere was on the threat for overuse of sanctions, that we were using sanctions too often in too many places too quickly. And in this case, what you've seen is a maximalist approach, with some exceptions, which we can talk about, but a maximalist approach to the use of sanctions and financial measures to unplug Russia from the global financial and commercial system, to target illicit assets, which Louise knows incredibly well and can explain better than anybody, and and to, in essence, apply a maximalist approach to see if it affects the calculus of the Kremlin in what they do further. And you've described it well. It's easy to sort of provide a taxonomy of the sanctions. You have the financial sanctions, which are really attacking the Russian bank's financial system and investment environment, which is largely being squeezed with some allowances, certainly allowances tied to oil and gas. And so you talk about taking banks off the SWIFT system. Gazprom Bank and Sberbank still remain on that system, in part to help facilitate oil and gas deals that are so important to Europe and other parts of the world. So that's been left as an exemption, but that's a key element, and it's been a maximalist approach, at least in theory, to trying to unplug the Russian system. You then have all of the export controls, the technology controls, which are intended to have longer term impact on the Russian economy and their ability to develop new technologies, support their key economic sectors, oil and gas, mineral, and the rest. And so that's been a key feature. And then third, really trying to weaponize the asset hunt and recovery efforts, which we've seen even today from the Department of Justice, where they are beginning to actively not just seek to find and freeze assets, but to bring civil and criminal actions to actually then attach assets and to recover them. Think of the yachts, the villas, the high order assets of the oligarchs, which are deemed to be close to the Kremlin or have profited from their relationship with the Kremlin and are seen now as a key target set for this regime. But at the end of the day, the question is, can this pressure work? And I think part of the problem, Patrick, is these measures, which are really aggressive measures and measures that see enforcement of sanctions that we haven't seen to date, are coming a little bit late. They are coming after the invasion. And I think it's too much to ask of sanctions, to ask them to turn back the tanks and to stop the invasion, especially with a committed actor like Putin. Will they and can they impose costs on the Russian economy? Absolutely. The Russian economy will be weaker. It's going to constrict, as it already is. The ruble, despite any daily fluctuations, is going to be weaker. You're going to have less companies investing in Russia, even those that are kind of still willing to trade out of China and India and Turkey and other countries. And so Russia is going to be hurt economically because of this. The question is, will that affect Putin's mindset? Will it stop further adventurism? And can it save Ukraine? It has to be part of the solution, but I think it's too much to ask sanctions to do all of that work on its own.
Yeah, it is important to note that these are economic measures intended to alter a political calculation. And these aren't just, again, one quiver in our arrow of potential policy responses. Louise, I was struck by Juan's use of the term asset hunt. So I want to pivot to you, and there's a great deal of opacity within the Russian state. We know that Putin is surrounded by cronies and oligarchs. During the State of the Union, the president announced a new task force, the Klepto Capture Task Force, that again was in the headlines today when the Attorney General announced some additional measures. So can you just give us a sense of how these sanctions are targeting oligarchs and how this asset hunt is ongoing? Okay, Louise, you're muted.
Certainly.
Here we are.
The oligarchs have huge amounts of assets outside of Russia. In fact, this elite that controls as much of the Russian economy as the vast majority of the Russian population has, since the early to mid 1990s, been sending huge amounts of money outside the country. And sometimes they're not sending the money outside the country, but they've been using what's called trade-based money laundering, where they would export natural resources and get that money paid into bank accounts in Switzerland or Cyprus, and then that money was stockpiled, and then it would be transferred sometimes to offshore havens. So this is an accumulation of huge amounts of capital over 30 years. And much of the revenues from oil and gas have not gone into Russia and have not been spent on development. What's really, and that's tragic. So Russia has already been suffering before these sanctions. And as Juan has pointed out very acutely, Russia will be deprived of many resources for its future development, let alone the fact that its IT leadership and others who are the brains of the country and of potential entrepreneurship are leaving en masse. But there's something that we need that almost nobody's talking about when they talk about the hunt for these oligarchs' money. And over a decade ago, the late Karen DeWisha wrote a wonderful book about the cronyism around Putin. And she discussed how many of these oligarchs who had these billions, that it wasn't all their billions. Some of it was Putin's billions, or sometimes it was the Russian state's billions. And that money could be tapped into when they were ordered to do something for the Russian state. And we certainly saw that during the Olympics, when these oligarchs were told to build this huge Olympic complex at Sochi that cost billions of dollars. And this wasn't done at this, allegedly at the state's expense but it was done through oligarchs who were told what to do with their money. So when we think about these sanctions and how they're working, we should also think that by freezing the oligarchs' money, Putin cannot be forcing these oligarchs to help meet Russian debt. They can't be helping circumvent these sanctions, which they might have been able to do if they weren't all frozen. So it's not just the fact that these oligarchs can put pressure on Putin, which I don't think is a very viable option. But it's the fact that these billions that are in private hands can't then be directed by the Russian state for other uses. And I think that's really important. But I think that when we're thinking about sanctions and going after the money, we're often thinking too narrowly. For example, we're looking at yachts and we're looking at property, and those are unbelievably expensive trinkets of the oligarchs. But we're not thinking about some of the ways that they're generating money. For example, there was a recent expose, which I've known about this case for a long time, in which Russians are deeply involved in illegal mining in Guatemala of a massive mine that helps support what you need for aluminum production. And the judges in Guatemala have ruled against this mine because it's on indigenous lands, the contracts were illegally acquired, but it's generating large amounts of money for Russian oligarchs. But we're focused on thinking about those trinkets in Europe and what's in the Mediterranean, and not thinking in a more global context of what is generating large amounts of money for Russians, which may be in places that we're just not thinking about, because we think Russia, Ukraine, and we don't think about the global economy and how Russians have invested there, and how, in fact, Russians are bribing the Guatemalan president so that they can keep running this mining operation that they need to keep sectors of their economy going. So we're thinking way too narrowly. And yes, it looks good when we seize a $500 million yacht, but we've got to be thinking much more globally of where we're going. And I think it's also, we need to also be thinking about what has happened previously with oligarchs and sanctions. So this is not the first time that we've imposed sanctions on Russia. We did a lot after 2014 when the Russians went into Crimea and Donbass. And what happened after that was a large phenomenon of corporate raiding. What is corporate raiding? in which powerfully connected businessmen go after the businesses of people who are less protected. And so you've had banks that were under sanctions and pressure like Sberbank going out and taking over companies, declaring them that they haven't paid their debt and making up cases. You've had highly protected individuals seizing major parts of the Russian economy, sometimes businesses as large as $500 million. And I think we've got to be thinking about what is going on in corporate rating and try and make sure that people who are surviving in business, who are providing employment for people, are not losing their businesses to these absolutely preying oligarchs that are left within Russia. And so we've got two issues we need to think about. We need to think about the oligarchs as Putin's pocketbooks and make sure that there's not some way that they're evading sanctions through wealthy individuals. And we need to think about how these oligarchs, internal oligarchs, mostly the ones connected to the security apparatus, the ones that are still left in Russia, are operating in a global economy and causing lots of harm that way. And we've got to think in a global context, not just a European context and a US context.
Great, thank you. Mandeep, I want to bring you into the conversation, and the cryptocurrency side of this is really fascinating to me. And there's a fear that cryptocurrencies could become a loophole for wealthy Russians to send money offshore, circumventing sanctions. As I mentioned in the opening, ECB President Lagarde has expressed concerns up on the Hill in Congress. Elizabeth Warren has introduced legislation to stymie Russian crypto transactions. So that brings to mind a couple of different questions. One is the risk that those targeted by sanctions will exploit cryptocurrency and cryptocurrency exchanges, and can crypto provide a means to evade sanctions? The second is, are there aspects of the technology, whether it's traceability, immutability, visibility, that can limit this risk? And then third is, while there's been a spike in Russian cryptocurrency transactions, I'm wondering, could the buyers be ordinary Russians who just want to hold on to their savings as the value of the ruble crashes and see cryptocurrencies as some form of safe harbor? So if you could try and thread all that together.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think, first of all, whenever we think about risks, it's important to keep the equation in mind that you're comparing opportunity offered by the technology with the costs. And financial crime costs are obviously a prominent part of the question you're asking. At its very core, if you think about the opportunity, right, blockchain systems offer fast, efficient movement of value using open systems with lots of controls built in a distributed manner, fast settlement, etc. So that obviously opens up lots of possibilities, lots of benefits. So that's the opportunity side of things. Then we think about the financial crime cost side of things, and you're right, the inherent risk associated with any new technology means that bad actors will try and consider exploiting that technology to achieve whatever nefarious ends they want to achieve. That is the inherent risk that we have to think about from a compliance perspective, from a private industry perspective. Then you think about the landscape that is a reality in this space, right? The landscape is that over the past several years, there has been way more development in terms of standard setting, either by FATF or by regulatory requirements that have been imposed on many different countries sort of players, including exchanges and wallets, and companies have to operate under these requirements. That's the reality we are living under. So if you look at the major cryptocurrency wallets and exchanges, we have to have comprehensive financial crime compliance programs. Why that's important is because it's not sufficient to say, oh yeah, somebody is a bad actor and can actually play in crypto. The idea is, okay, what do they do with the crypto? They have to bring in the funds. So the on-ramp needs to happen, for which they have to go through these major exchanges or wallets. And then once they are within the crypto ecosystem, they have to off-ramp. So leave the crypto world and go to the fiat world to actually go and engage in real goods and services, buying out there at scale, right? And so the important point becomes these crypto exchanges and wallets that sit at that on-ramp and off-ramp have comprehensive financial crime programs that range from know your customer requirements. They're supposed to collect identity verification. They're supposed to look at what the customer's business is, who is the underlying beneficial owner, like owner of this customer. Now, of course, we are not going to catch every single instance where somebody might misuse this process, but the idea is that the hurdle is pretty high from a compliance control perspective. And then as part of that, there's sanction screening requirements that get built in. And then all these cryptocurrency wallets and exchanges, including Circle, my company, we perform transaction monitoring. We have systems in place. We're constantly trying to build an automation to catch typologies that may be used in sort of real time, looking at batch processing as well. Then you come back to what new sort of innovative technologies does blockchain offer that can help us get even better than the banks today can do within their environment, right? So, and the best part of blockchain systems is that any transaction that happens, it gets posted real time for everybody to see. What that automatically does is it opens up the opportunity for vendors, analytics tools, in-house compliance officers, law enforcement to go in, understand the end-to-end traceability of what is happening with the transaction. So it goes from one wallet to the other. It's gone to a different crypto exchange. It's gone through 40 hops. You can actually see end-to-end where something is going. And then there are concepts like attribution of those wallets to the real world. So the moment any of these hops touch those on-ramps or off-ramps, or there can be any other connection back to the real world, something trips and that can allow you to see the full chain of something going wrong. That opportunity cannot exist in the opaque systems, right? And in the traditional systems, compliance officers and law enforcement are very dependent on very narrow, siloed visibility that they have to what's happening in their internal databases. You can be effective within that context, but obviously money launderers and bad actors are playing way beyond that narrow context, right? So that's the benefit from a blockchain monitoring perspective. And then there are other sort of tools that the industry is working on, like decentralized ID is a great concept out there that people are looking at. But again, no compliance system is sort of watertight, can catch everything. We have to keep monitoring how this thing is evolving, what sort of liquidity is out there for people to use maybe unregulated exchanges in other less developed countries from a regulatory perspective. At scale, what kind of typologies are being used? So I think this is something we have to watch and then continue sort of understanding if bad actors are going to use these open systems where traceability is there and all these compliance requirements are there, or are they going to use the traditional opaque systems like creating shell companies, etc., where you cannot actually see what's happening? So that's the overall way I would answer your three questions.
Thank you, Mandeep. Louise, you've spent your career looking at illicit finance, and the crypto matter is a relatively new development. I just welcome your thoughts as you look at broadly at illicit finance, but also given your career's work looking at the oligarchic system within Russia, whether you see some of these actors still, in spite of all the compliance matters that Mandeep outlined and the traceability issues and the attribution of wallets, do you still see them maybe trying to use these digital assets to hide their funds? You're muted again.
Absolutely. And one of the issues has been that just in the last few days, the German federal police, with the assistance of the US government, shut down a major dark web website through which billions went through, a lot of it using cryptocurrencies. And because of this issue of corporate raiding, which I mentioned, in which there's not a lot of licit entrepreneurship in the tech side in Russia, there is so many bad, or I should say tech that have gone to the bad side. And they use a lot of cryptocurrencies, both in the dark web and online platforms. They've been very involved in this space, also with cryptocurrencies and online pharmacies, through which they're selling drugs disguised as Canadian pharmacies, but they're really Russians, and they're selling counterfeit drugs that they obtain from India through these pharmacies. And so some of this is going on through official payment systems and some of this is going on through cryptocurrency. So these are some of the new angles that we need to be looking at and we can imagine are going to grow. And once that multi-billion-dollar dark web website was taken down, which Russians were behind, we're going to see others emerging. So we need to be looking at this constantly changing framework and structure of the illicit world in which they operate.
Thank you. Juan, you, in the various seats you've held in government, at Treasury and at the White House, you've designed sanctions regimes, but never targeting the 11th largest economy in the world. So it strikes me that if we put everything into context, we are playing with global financial markets in response to what is a local war in Europe. So I'm wondering how this plays out within the broader global economy, potential ripple effects. And then if you could give us some insight into how, when they go into a principals meeting, how Secretary Yellen, Secretary Blinken are trying to wrap their heads around limiting the risk to the American economy, to the broader global economy, as they are really trying to have an aggressive response to Putin's acts of aggression.
Yeah, Patrick, great question. And you're right, targeting an economy like Russia is no easy feat. It's a large economy, huge dependencies in Europe, obviously a petro power, which creates all sorts of challenges. And I've said often that Putin has used oil and gas as the sword and shield in the sanctions domain, right? And we're seeing that clearly with what Germany's having to grapple with in terms of whether or not to turn off the spigot. And it's very difficult to do if you don't have an alternative. But you're right. I think, one way of looking at this and taking a step back is we are now applying every sort of tool that we've designed in the past to attack the Russian economy, with some holes. Obviously, oil and gas is a major gap, and we haven't moved towards secondary sanctions. But we've shifted the paradigm in a way that even President Biden in his Warsaw speech talked about, a new form of economic statecraft, one that really does start to look like warfare. And Patrick, I wrote about this in Treasury's War.
Fantastic book, highly recommended.
Thank you, I appreciate it. The reason I mentioned is not to plug the book, but to merely point out that, those states that have been targets of, aggressive sanctions campaigns have understood that to be a form of not just statecraft or competition, but actual warfare. And that's the way Putin sees this. He's said that. They said it in 2014 when the threat of taking Russian banks off the SWIFT system was put on the table. 2 Russian senior officials said we would consider that an act of war. We're now in a place where Putin has said all of these sanctions are part of warfare against Russia. It's what the Iranians have said. It's what the North Koreans have said. So this is a part of warfare. And I think what's interesting is I think the world has now woken up to that. And so to answer your question about the principals meeting, I think now Secretary Yellen has a leading role at the national security table. And the question to her, likewise to her deputy Walia, in the sit room is what more can be done? And what is the headroom to allow for escalatory dominance to continue in a way that pressures Russia and allows for us to have maximum flexibility to affect the decision-making with 3 other variables? You pointed them out, Patrick. One is, how do we make sure we don't do anything to fundamentally harm the US economy, right? And so early days, the president talked a lot about inflation and gas prices, right? So that's fundamentally important. 2, don't do anything to destroy the international financial system, and in particular, the Western-led elements of that. So how do we do this in a way that doesn't push people away from the US capitalist system? And 3rd, how do you do this in a way that doesn't overly harm the European economies? How do we stay in line with the Germans and others that have these high levels of dependency on Russian oil and gas? How do we square that circle? And I think, Patrick, something they're having to answer now is, how do you sustain this? right? Because it's one thing to say, let's surge with a sanctions shock and awe approach. It's another question as to how do you sustain this in a way that makes the sanctions effective and doesn't create cracks in the system. So all of that is being posed to Janet Yellen in the sit room.
And as I look at it, I think that that alliance cohesion question is the question of the day now. I want to turn actually and look a bit at Russia's economy and and how they've somewhat weathered the storm. The Russia's currency initially crashed after we imposed sanctions a few weeks ago, but the ruble slightly recovered. Part of that is due to revenues from oil and gas that has helped Moscow offset the costs of the war. So just I'll pose this to Louise first, given the amount of time that she spent looking at Russia's economy. Just your thoughts on how Russia's weathered the war, how they can continue to maintain this war effort with these diminished financial resources.
The question is, how much is Putin aware of what is happening to him economically? Because while we're discussing things openly, one's not sure how much he is learning. But one of the most important sanctions that have been put on Russia is this enormous sort of safety chest that they assembled in a dollared economy to help them weather any crisis. And at least a half of that has now been frozen. So how long they can prop up the economy and how long now that the oligarchs' money that's not hidden in shell companies can be used to prop up the economy. We're at 5 weeks. You can weather something for a little bit as you pay your initial debts, but what happens in the long term? And it's not just oil and gas. There are the region where this war is being fought is also the breadbasket of the world, not just from Ukraine, but from Russia. So this is also having enormous fallout. And I saw in the chat box someone asking about clean energy. And I think one of the concerns one needs to think about is, will this and hopefully accelerate the transition to clean energy, which should have happened much earlier and will affect Russia in the long term. And Russia also faces many, many financial challenges in the next decade. For example, the fate of talking about climate change, of global warming, is just enormous in Siberia and the Russian Far East, where the permafrost is melting and the levels below the permafrost are melting. And Russian infrastructure in a large part of the country, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, cities are built on this decaying, sinking soil. And so there are going to be increasing economic demands on Russia because they're suffering immediately and they're not going to have the resources to meet this demand. So their cities are not being leveled like in Ukraine, but they will soon be sinking into sinkholes from what is going on in their territory. And that's something else that they're not planning for and don't have the resources to deal with as they've gone off on this military escapade that's costing them a fortune in money and people.
Thank you for bringing up those two very important points, and it is something that's that needs to be part of the conversation if we're going to have a comprehensive conversation. Juan, I do want to toss something to you that Louise just brought up, and that is the matter of Russian debt. So part of the new sanctions regime that was unveiled just today is Treasury halting dollar debt payments from the Russian government accounts to U.S. banks. So that's, of course, supposed to put increased pressure on Moscow to find sources of funding to pay bond investors. And it's designed to force Russia into choosing between draining their dollar reserves held in its own currency, spending new revenue, or going into default. So there has been some commentary out there about the risks of a Russian default. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Patrick, it's a great question because there was, sort of initial anticipated defaults because of bond payments that were due over the last couple of weeks. Didn't happen, of course. in part because the Treasury allowed for those payments to happen back into the US banks that were involved. What you're describing is a shutting off of that channel and the allowances. It was already starting to get difficult as we watched the reaction around the world to having Russian entities make payments back into the West. There was already some of those payments getting frozen, some of the transactions getting blocked. So it was already getting very difficult and frictionful, if you will, to do that. Now what you have is that spigot, at least from the US perspective, being shut. And what you really are going to see then are defaults happening with respect to both Russian sovereign debt and then Russian corporate debt. And this becomes a next phase of the crisis for the Russian economy. And to Louise's point, we're just 5 weeks in. A lot of these measures really haven't taken hold. There have been a lot of exemptions in the sanctions regime, or at least timing that is allowed for things to kind of play out. That is now shrinking, the timetable's diminishing. You now have the new provision. In addition, you have no new investment going into Russia, and more companies shutting their doors, which has only quickened over time. And so all of that in combination over the course of weeks and months is only going to weaken the Russian economy further and going to cast doubt as to whether or not any legitimate business can or wants to do business in and through Russia or with Russian entities moving forward. I think the easy answer, and the answer you've seen from at least most Western companies, is probably not and not really. And this is part of that equation.
So we've mentioned oil and gas, and that's maybe an additional sanction that we can levy by shutting that off completely. There's additional individual designations that could be made as we continue to ratchet up financial pressure. One thing we have not talked about today is secondary sanctions. And when I think about secondary sanctions, I think specifically about China and India, who have not joined the alliance imposing sanctions on Russia. So I guess the big question here is, would the US impose secondary sanctions on Chinese firms, commercial banks, and even the People's Republic of China? Should they help Russia evade sanctions? And so far, we've stated that we will impose costs on China that they support Russia's aggression, but we've stopped short of actually imposing those costs. So I guess, Juan, I'll toss that to you, and then I'll round out to the rest of the panel. Just your thoughts on that matter.
Yeah, you're right, Patrick. That is a major element of the sanctions regime that has not been put in place. Secondary sanctions, for those who may not know, is the use of sanctions against third parties that are doing business with sanctioned parties. So they're not sanctioned themselves. It may not be sanctions evasion. It's the mere threat of the use of sanctions by US or other authorities to go after these third parties. Let's say Chinese entities or individuals, or Turkish or Indian or others. The power of secondary sanctions, frankly, is in the threat of secondary sanctions, right? And so I think what you'll see at some point is a secondary sanctions regime put in place with maybe some select targets of major scofflaws that are really backfilling the Russian economy as targets. And in that regard, we do think, and I do see that, the Chinese targets are on the table. Chinese targets have been hit before in the Iranian context. Kunlun Bank was hit with a version of secondary sanctions in the Iranian context. It's not a huge bank, systemically not all that relevant, but it is a signal that the US is willing to use secondary sanctions in certain instances to go after key targets. And I think if you have the Chinese or the Indians or other economies going in aggressively to backfill the Russian economy, and not in ways just to deal in oil and gas, as the Indians are doing quite openly, but in other ways, I think the US will be very open to targeting and sanctioning entities. And it will be one way that the US will try to discipline and fence ring the sanctions regime in a way that warns the Chinese from getting too involved or too supportive of the Russian economy.
Great, thanks. I'm not sure, Mandeep, if you have any thoughts on this consideration of secondary sanctions, or if Louise does, but please jump in if you do. Otherwise, we got a couple of other questions I'd like to pose.
Yeah, just from my perspective, we have to keep monitoring this evolving sort of nature of the sanctions regimes, right? And as soon as any announcement sort of, we believe there's probability that an announcement is going to happen directionally towards secondary sanctions. We have to make sure that all our systems are properly tuned. We're ready to look at these connections between wallets that target these Chinese entities or individuals or the Indian ones. And we have to make sure that those are implemented sort of real time as they happen, right? So we are tracking all of this. Again, all the crypto exchanges and wallets that have programs have to track this, make sure they're prepared for it. That's the only thing I'll say there.
Strikes me there's a huge compliance cost there.
Absolutely.
Louise, your thoughts?
I'm ready to go on to the next question.
Okay, great. Actually, this is one that I do want to toss to you. And one thing I've been struck by is the UK. There was a fantastic segment on 60 Minutes. It was either this past week or the week prior, looking at how oligarchs are entrenched in the UK economy, specifically in London and in property markets there. So I've really been struck that this has been a real shift in British policy, that they are targeting these oligarchs, and they're even not just targeting the oligarchs themselves, they're going beyond and targeting their family members. So how significant do you think this development is?
I think it's really significant. I mean, London's been called Londongrad because the oligarchs have moved in there, and they have kept so much of the British economy or financial economy going, between lawyers, London Court of International Arbitration, banks, real estate agents. And there's been such a hesitancy to go after the oligarchs because all of this financial center was absolutely key to maintaining the British economy. And so this is happening in a period of post-Brexit, where Britain is trying to keep its important financial status in the world, but it's now outside the EU, and now it's being hit and having to respond to this real discreditation of their economy as being a major facilitator of highly corrupt individuals and their money. And it'll be very important to watch. And the fact that they're ready to sanction all these family members reflects a profound understanding of how these oligarchs operate and transfer things to even their stepchildren or their son-in-laws or whoever they need to protect and hide their ownership. And so there's a question on hiding ownership. And yes, they try and do it, but it's not always so hidden.
We're nearly out of time. Juan, I want to toss one final question to you. And we've had a number of conversations over the years. We've described sanctions as almost the Swiss Army knife of US foreign policy tools. And they're relatively easy to apply, but they're difficult to unwind. One thing that I've noticed within the context of these sanctions is that they've all been at the discretion of the executive branch. They are not enshrined in statute by the Congress. So when we do hopefully get to a point of negotiated settlement over the war in Ukraine, how do we unwind what has been let loose?
It's a great question, Patrick, because I mean, in theory, you want the sanctions to drive incentives toward a diplomatic solution, and you change the behavior and the calculus of the target here. And so you hope that Putin decides the cost of this is too much, and the weight of this plus Ukrainian resistance and Russian isolation globally is too much to take, and so it leads to diplomacy. So you hope that the sticks of sanctions are converted to the carrots of negotiations, right? And you can then calibrate them in that way. And you're right that Congress in many ways has allowed the administration to move forward, in part because the administration moved quickly, they've moved aggressively. Congress wants to get involved, and they will eventually. They'll probably pass a secondary sanctions provision of some sort, right? So Congress will want to get in the game, but this is really being driven by the executive and then obviously European and Asian allies as well. I think, Patrick, what will be most complicating to this, and you've seen this in the Iranian JCPOA nuclear negotiation context, is not so much the ability to withdraw a sanction officially, but whether or not the reputational risk and broader risks that are attendant to doing business with Russia continue. This was the problem in 2015 with Iran, because even if sanctions were lifted in some form or fashion, there were still a whole host of sanctions-related risks, as well as illicit finance risks, corruption risks. And so Western banks, for example, didn't rush into Tehran to do business. And it wasn't because they weren't allowed to, it was because they didn't like the risk and they couldn't manage the risk. And the same thing will go here. You know, the fact that companies have left, they've shuttered their doors, they've decided to withdraw from their investments, they're selling their holdings. That's very hard to unwind. And so the re-entry of Russia into the global system is going to be much harder than anything that's negotiated at the table. And I think that's going to be the difficulty of unwinding.
Great, thank you. Well, we are out of time. Mandeep, Juan, Louise, thank you all for joining us and trying to shed light on this fast-moving situation. Fantastic conversation. Again, I really appreciate you all taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.